Last time I was here was in 2015. That was a very important year, and I would not like to miss it. 2015, when we met here to have a debate between practitioners, politicians, talking about what was coming on to us. 1 million people or so on the move in direction of all our countries. Europe felt like an attack. Felt like, I was in Austria at the time, the Austrians felt like the Turks, the Ottomans standing again in front of Vienna, something like that. But I would not like to miss that year, because it was a year of change. It was a year which brought to us the real issues of ourselves, of our societies, and what I hope still will remain our Europe. Because until 2015, the discussion about migration was limited about our intra-European migration. The enlargement of the European Union, Bulgarians coming to Germany, Romanians coming to Germany, that was the discussions we had. Polish people and so on and so forth. That whole thing within Europe, that was the only migration link we had. And that was a sleepy discussion. That was not a real emotional discussion. It was not a political discussion. It was just something about whether people should get social benefits or not when they move from one country to the next one. I mean, that is not enough. And it was also not a discussion about the true values of what Europe means. And it was also not a discussion about what aid and solidarity and global responsibilities mean, and our relationship with the global south and with countries and regions we have always been colonizing and exploiting. And so that happened in 2015, a complete yes, exactly, shock therapy. That was exactly the wake-up call. Thank you for whoever did that. The wake-up call needed to get out of this sleepy sort of discussion, boring, I mean, I always say the boring German type intellectual masturbation taking place. That shock therapy, what did it bring to us? It brought us to understanding that our societies have an issue. I mean, at least where I come from, I mean, I'm German, but I've never lived in Germany. I'm a happy migrant, by the way. I'm not a desperate migrant. I'm a happy migrant. I lived all over the world in happiness, dealing with misery, that's admitted, but by my own decision. But for instance, my Germany discovered that it has something like poverty. 20% of Germans are at risk of poverty as we speak. 20% of the children going to school don't really have food security in Germany, for God's sake. Second, I grew up in Berlin after obviously during the time there was still a wall. We were, and I was in the 70s, between 8 and 18, between 1970 and 1980. At the time, we were brainwashed as Germans. Never again. Never fascism again. It shall never happen again. Never anything in this direction. We even learned in Latin classes to detect the language of dictators, of being manipulated. That was our education, but it also led to something else. We were brainwashed in the direction of there shall be no nationalism and there shall be Europe as our future. The future of Europe being a peace project. And that has been unfortunately lost as well, because we transformed that into a political and economic expansion. We were trying to capture territory from, I mean, we all know how complicated, and you know that better than I do, how complicated that was, capture territory from the former, Soviet bloc and so on. So it was all driven by totally different motivations. So for me, that has also been exposed by the way of how Europe has developed since 2015. Anyway, and the third part, and that's where I come from, or where at least I grew up into, that is the world of aid. Because basically there was 1.5 million people, 1.5 million people, telling us, guys, it does not work. Aid out there does not work. If you think that you can keep us happy in our Africas and our Asias and in the Middle East with a few kilocalories, with a few liters of water, a bit of aid here and there, then you're wrong. That was the message they brought with them as well, and saying, we are human beings out there like everyone else, and it is not enough to try with a little bit of aid which is available globally to keep us quiet. Now times have come, we come to you if you don't share your resources, which you have been taking, by the way, from us in a more just way. Every year, aid, this means humanitarian aid, development aid, is a mere ridiculous $200 billion US. That's what is spent by the whole world on all the people who are kind of either in a disaster and need immediate help, or are simply in need of getting to the next stage in development and so on. So 200 billion is nothing. Anybody who knows a bit about figures understands that that represents maybe a highway construction project. It represents maybe the balance sheet of, let's say, a medium-sized international corporation, but that is what we collectively only mobilize for all the crises, for all disaster, for all the effects of climate change and so on and so forth, 200 billion. What has happened since 2015 in many European countries as a result of this? What has happened to our post-Second World War story about multilateral structures and peace building? Well, the answer is very simple. It's the right, extreme right, populist, nationalist movements and parties which have benefited from it. And there is something, again, scary about it, and there's something which should be mobilizing those who don't believe in that. So I'm just using that opportunity here as well to share this. There is an attempt to further create fear before the European elections. Let's not follow that movement. We all agree that, or we should all agree, that we are sitting here because there has been migration in our history. You are, I am, we are all results of migration and refuge. There have been people moving throughout history, always. There will be people moving in the future. So migration is something which is our evolution. That story we have to be very clear about. Nobody is saying it has been easy. Migration, refuge, displacement has been linked to a lot of suffering, to a lot of injustice. People have been pushed out, people moved on. And so that acceptance that this has been always part of humanity is very important. It doesn't mean we have to accept injustice. We have to accept that people on moving forward is part of us. And we have moved through the world. It has created a lot of tension. It has created a lot of suffering. But that is really us. Globally, we are a result of that migration. So that's number one, which we have to retain for ourselves. Number two is, of course, nobody is, and we have to divide that very clearly from the difficulties it may cause to live together with new people, with other religions, which has been a major discussion over the last few years, because a lot of the people came by Muslims into more or less Christian Orthodox societies. Yes, that's more tricky eventually, but it has always been tricky. There's also something which is important to retain. Most of the people in history never returned. And I call this the myth of return. The myth of return, especially when we hear that word refugee, at least those who have, let's say, a more positive idea about refugees, constantly talk about the happiness of a refugee to return home to the place of origin. That is a myth. It is the wrong perception of people who have moved and have been pushed out. Of course, somebody, be it a Palestinian, be it a Tamil, be it whoever has been pushed out of his home, will dream about that place, about that house where he used to grow up, the village where he was. But will he, she, the family return? Even if they could, many people wouldn't. So let's move away from that. A good refugee is a returning refugee idea. A good migrant is a returning migrant idea. Move much further ahead and say human beings change. There is transformation. The moment somebody moves, he is already a changed person. And accept that there is a new perspective, there is a new life which is coming up. This is exactly what has happened in so many countries. Talking about Afghanistan. Afghanistan is a country where lots of people return to Afghanistan. Millions return to Afghanistan. Did anybody return to the villages? No. When people returned from Iran or from Pakistan, they returned into the towns, into the cities. And that is actually our real challenge of the 21st century. That is urbanization, transformation, massive transformation taking place currently. Currently, 50% of humanity means half of 7.5 billion people live in cities, live in urban centers. In Europe, we underwent that transformation, and the prediction is that in 2050 it will be 75% of us, but 75% of 10 billion people. So we're going to see an increase of at least 2 billion people moving into cities over the next 25 years, 30 years. That is in fact our real challenge, besides obviously many of these factors which influence that. Climate change, be it climate shocks or be it gradual change. You're not having any more 5 potatoes coming out of a field, but 3 potatoes or 2 potatoes. So in the end, at some point you're moving, or the sea level is rising slowly and your house gets flooded more and more often, and so on. So there's a lot of this happening, but it's also because of that. Digitalization, access to information, simply what happened to our own societies, at least in Germany, was sort of in the 19th century, beginning of the 20th. You're not satisfied anymore to hang around in a village where nothing is happening. You want to be part of a modern society. You want to be part of the world. So if anybody has the idea that you keep an African villager back in a village because you're making a water well, or give him five chicken and 10 goats or something, then you're totally wrong. So the real challenge is around that. 2 billion people moving. But what does it mean? 150,000 people every day, somewhere in the world currently moving into a city. 50,000 in Africa every day. And my God, I mean, we're getting into panic because there's 150,000 swimming across the Mediterranean. I mean, give me a break. The mayor of Lagos, the city of Lagos, he has to deal with 1 million people every year coming into Lagos. That's his challenge. Cairo, 500,000 people every year. These guys, for me, are really, I mean, they have an impossible task. And where do these people end up? Many of them end up because it's very badly managed they end up in informality, informal settlements, slums. There's currently 1 billion people in very bad slums and very bad settlements all over the world. So the real number of people really in trouble is very high, yes. Are they all coming here? No, they're not coming here. It's a very small portion. So it's suddenly, if we accept that, it's not so impossible to deal with this anymore. But what I'm advocating for, and it may sound very neoliberal to some, but what I'm advocating for is that we take that issue of urbanization not as the evil, but as a reality which we have to deal with. We need to understand, and there's a whole school, of course, which would defend that. We need to understand that urbanization is a driver for positive change, for people to evolve as well. Accept that connectivity, in fact, is our only chance for survival. That we have incredible ways of communication, of connectivity between the demand for knowledge, the demand for resources, the demand for solutions, and the supply of solutions. And again, what is driving that is digitalization, whether we want it or not.